Hey guys, it's Leah. Welcome back, or welcome if you are new, and welcome to the video of me going through every single book that I read in 2024 and whether they are worth your time or not. I read 119 books in 2024. I was incredibly happy with that number, and I'm not gonna lie, we had range and we absolutely had a mix of amazing books, some disappointing books, some very middle of the road books, and books that I also feel incredibly passionately about, whether negative or positive. I'm here to talk to you about it. This video is likely going to be longer than my normal videos, so definitely feel free to go grab your favourite drink or your favourite snack. I have my favourite peppermint tea because I'm anticipating my voice to be sore after this video, I'm not gonna lie. But let's get into all of the books. So the books that I started 2024 with was A Tempest of Tea by Hafsa Faisal. This was a new YA fantasy with a heist, and I'm not gonna lie, I have definitely realised when it comes to fantasy books that I'm not obsessed with heists. This one was fun. I do love starting my years with 5-star predictions or a 5-star read. Was it a 5-star read? Unfortunately not. I am intrigued to carry on with the series though. I would recommend it if you're looking for a fun, fast-paced YA fantasy. Then we had The Besieged City by Clarice Lispector. We obviously know how I love Clarice Lispector. She is my #1 favourite author of all time. She is my girl. One thing about me, I fear all literature could disappear from me and I could read absolutely nothing else for the rest of my life other than a Clarice Lispector, and I would still feel so content and so happy with that. The Besieged City specifically though was my second favourite book of 2024. I absolutely adored it. It's definitely up there with one of my favourite novels from Clarice in and of itself. If you love anything that is sentient but shouldn't be, like A Sentient City for example, please read this. It was absolutely astonishing. Then we have The Unfortunate Side Effects of Heartbreak and Magic. I am not gonna lie to you guys, I really did not like this book. Talking about some things in fantasy that I don't think I 100% enjoy, I have only read a handful of cozy fantasies that I actually really liked. This was not one of them. Maybe this book should have just been called The Unfortunate. It was not for me. Then we had We Spread by Ian Reid. I really like this. I'm somebody who absolutely adores ambiguous literature, especially if it leans more post-apocalyptic or slightly unhinged or unreliable narratives. I absolutely love everything like that. I will say, if you don't like ambiguous stories or books that end more ambiguous than they even begin with, you're not gonna like this, but I loved it. I would highly recommend if so. Delicate Dream Department Store. I feel like I'm definitely in the minority of this, and like I said with cozy fantasy, this wasn't really for me. 10 out of 10 for the concept. I loved the whole idea of a department store existing in your dreams where you can go and buy what dream you want to have that night. The execution was unfortunately not there for me. I just found it a little bit too boring and not really much happened, but I suppose it is comforting and quite cozy for that. Daydream and Drunkenness of a Young Lady by Clarice Lispector. This is a tiny, like 50-page short story collection from Clarice. I think if you're wanting to get into her work but you're quite intimidated and you don't really know where to start, this would be a good one. I would recommend going into any of her short story collections. They are all amazing. In this one specifically though, it has so many of my favourites from her ever, so I would definitely recommend. You Again by Kate Goldbeck. This is a When Harry Met Sally rom-com retelling, and I absolutely love this. I had the time of my life reading this. Do I kind of regret that I read it in January and I didn't wait for it in autumn? Absolutely. It is the epitome of autumn. Like the cover alone. It also has bisexual representation. The banter in this, I was obsessed with the characters. I would highly recommend. Another one that I would recommend is Ripe by Sarah Rosetta. Absolutely for a different reason, babe. This one will rip your heart out. If you love literary fiction that discusses consumerism and capitalism and also mental health, I would definitely recommend this, but I would also recommend checking up trigger warnings. This is definitely a heavy book, but I genuinely think about it all of the time. I absolutely adored it. I want to do a reread, but the last page had me staring at a blank wall for about 2 hours straight. The Pumpkin Spice Cafe I read because everyone was reading it and everyone was absolutely adoring it, and I'm not gonna lie, babe, all I remember, spice, and not even really good spice. I don't know if I'm ever gonna carry on with this series, but I know so many people love them, and I mean, like, it was what it was. The Mystery Guest by Nita Prose. This is the second book in the Maid series by Nita Prose. I am not gonna lie, I didn't really enjoy The Maid when I first read it, and from that I definitely went into it not expecting for it to be my favourite thing in the entire world, and I suppose I was right because I did not enjoy this. I did read another Nita Prose after this at the end of the year, which you will see, but I don't think I'm gonna read anything from this author again. I just don't think her writing style nor her mysteries are for me. What is for me though, Magnolia Park's The Long Way Home by Jessa Hastings. I love this series so much. If Jessa Hastings has no fans, I'm dead, babe. This series has my entire heart. These characters, real to me. I actually fully expect to bump into them every single time I'm in London. I'm just obsessed. All About Love by Bell Hooks is a non-fiction book that I had on my radar for years, and I had quite high expectations about it. It discusses at length different forms of love and feminism, and I'm not gonna lie, going into it, it was nothing new to me. I had read all of this prior. I already knew all of this information, but I suppose sometimes it is nice to get a reminder. Death Valley by Melissa Broder. Babe, if you're into weird fiction, please read this book. Pitched as the Chronicles of Narnia, but instead of a wardrobe, it's a cactus. Unhinged, messy discussions surrounding grief and acceptance. Loved it. 5 out of 5 stars for me. The Risk by St. Abbey. I actually didn't continue with this series, but this is the first book in the Mindfuck series, and I am kind of tempted to. Does the series carry on getting better, / is it worth carrying on? Because this was definitely a fun, again, messy time. Basically following this female serial killer and this FBI agent who is working her case, but he doesn't know that she is the one killing all of these people. It was messy, but kind of fun. One that was messy, but in a not so fun way, Earthlings by Siaka Murata. Absolutely another author that if you're into weirder literary fiction and literary fiction that pushes boundaries quite a bit, Siaka Murata is incredible. This was both at once utterly unhinged. My jaw was on the floor, but equally so heavy and so heartbreaking. Absolutely recommend checking trigger warnings for this one. I don't think Siaka Murata's works I would recommend to everybody at any point, but if you are into that sort of thing, I would definitely recommend checking out trigger warnings, like I said, but her writing is just so incredible. The Catch by Amy Lee. I actually really enjoy Amy Lee's romances. This is like a series following a group of influencers. I do believe that this was the last one. I'm fairly certain it was following a fashion influencer and the love interest was a fisherman. It was fun. They are always really quick and bingeable. I liked it. White Nights by Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky is an author, like most, that I really want to read, but I'm definitely intimidated by. Actually, genuinely, Dostoevsky could have stabbed me in the heart himself and it would have hurt less than reading this book. This was devastating but so beautiful. Another devastating but so beautiful read, Dostoevsky would approve, Daisy Hates and the Great Undoing by Jessa Hastings. This is definitely my favourite book in the entire Magnolia Park series. I am a Daisy Hates girl to my core. Julian Hates. That one line in this book, if you've read it, you know I'm not going to say it, because reading that for the first time was both a blessing and an absolute curse. I love this book so much. Another 5-star of the year for me was by Grand Central Station, I Sat Down and Wept by Elizabeth Smart. I love a lyrical literary novella, and this was exactly that. Every single page of this read like poetry, discusses at length unrequited love and love as an adult and being an artist, and I actually underlined every single word of this. I swear to God, if I could get a tattoo of it all up my arm, I would. Bad Diaspora Poems by Mumtaz Amiri. I absolutely adored this poetry collection. It discusses race, racism and immigration, and the writing was absolutely astonishing. I desperately want to read something else from this author or some more poetry. Would highly recommend. Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll. This was a fiction / crime read that was everywhere last year, and rightfully so. An absolutely incredible fictionalized account following one of America's biggest serial killers. I'm not going to say who it is. I didn't know when going into this. It is fairly obvious, but I do think the not knowing and then reading this book made the experience so much more interesting. I love fiction that describes true crime and people's obsession with true crime and how morally questionable that is, and this did it in such an incredible way. I would highly recommend. Also, the audiobook was fantastic. Then we entered one of my biggest hyperfixations of 2024, and that was my Carissa Broadbent era with The Serpent in the Wings of Night. The Crowns of Nyaxia series has actually taken over my life. I'm fairly certain that this is the book that made me realise that, do you know what, yeah, I am a little bit of a romantasy girl. Trials, the world building, the vampire element, would highly recommend. I loved it. Fantasy that I didn't love as much, however, was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. Like I've already touched upon, I'm not a huge cozy fantasy girl. I don't know why. I feel like I could be. If anyone has any good recommendations, please let me know. I am quite intrigued to reread this physically. I did listen to the audiobook, did not like the audiobook, but this book is beautiful. Like, I want to reread it again solely for the cover, but it was okay. Six Scorched Roses by Carissa Broadbent. This is definitely my favourite book in the Crowns of Nyaxia series yet, and this is a novella. You can also kind of read it as a standalone. The tension in this, the characters in this, the yearning. If you're looking for yearning in fantasy romance or romantasy, this is your book, babe. 5 stars. I then carried on my fantasy era with my next hyperfixation of 2024. If you were here for that, I absolutely love you. It was Once Upon a Broken Heart, the entire series. I did film a reading vlog reading the entirety of the series. There are spoiler sections, non-spoiler sections. It's one of my favourite videos that I filmed throughout the entirety of last year, and this series, I'm convinced, changed the trajectory of my reading. Like, this made me fully fall back in love with fantasy. That and Carissa Broadbent. I owe Stephanie Garber and Carissa Broadbent my life. Obviously, my favourite book in the series was The Ballad of Never After. The ending of this book I genuinely think about every single day. I am so convinced that, like, on my deathbed, this will be my dying thought. I loved it. And then I carried on that fantasy streak with The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King by Carissa Broadbent. Definitely my least favourite in that series yet, but I still really enjoyed it. I'm obsessed with this world. There is nothing that Carissa Broadbent could write that I wouldn't enjoy. We then have Bluets by Maggie Nelson. This is both at once a poetry collection and sort of an autobiography. This is just her musings on the colour blue, where she finds the colour blue, the metaphors of the colour blue. Like, the colour blue, babe, working overtime. Definitely realise when it comes to poetry and fiction, I love musings on one specific thing or like a colour. The White Book by Han Kang being one, for example. Lewis was okay. If you're looking for this sort of thing, I would recommend The White Book over it, but I'm happy that I had finally read it. Dead Animals by Phoebe Starks. I'm not gonna lie, babe, I completely forgot I read this. I couldn't even tell you what happened in it. Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata. This is a short story collection by Sayaka Murata and was just as weird as all of her actual novellas. I was completely floored by it though. When I say that she pushes the boundaries and the norms of society, she really does. She does it with her entire chest, and you know what? It completely works. The societal metaphors that I literally embedded so subtly into her works are astounding. I just love her so much. I'll read anything that she writes. I also, again, feel that way with Jessa Hastings. This one was Magnolia Park's Into the Dark. I sobbed like a bitch at this book. I'm convinced this book made me cry more than any other book, not only in 2024, but in my entire life. Poor Things by Alistair Gray. I read this because I watched Poor Things at the very beginning of 2024 and it instantly became one of my favourite films of all time. Like, why is it such a controversial film? I actually think it's a work of art. I adored it, but the book, I wish I had never read it. Modern Divination by Isabel Agajanian. I read this when it was indie published, and oh my god, if you like divine rivals, academic rivals to lovers in a fantasy setting with dark academia, you're gonna eat this up. Die My Love by Ariana Hoeks. When I tell you that the day that this movie comes out, I am gonna be first in line to the cinema. I cannot wait to watch it. This is definitely a book that I wouldn't recommend to everybody. It is utterly unhinged and quite hard to read in places. We are following a mother who desperately hates her husband and her son to the point that she fantasizes about their loss of life. It is utterly unhinged, but the writing is so compelling. Only One Left by Riley Sager is definitely one of my favourite Riley Sager books that I've read. I was very pleasantly surprised by this. The plot twist, babe, I could not stop reading it. I was utterly obsessed with it. I think if you're looking for a fun, bingeable adult thriller, this is a really good one. Powerless by Lauren Roberts. I'm not gonna lie, I read this because I had such bad FOMO. I entered my fantasy era and I was like, how can I not read one of the biggest fantasy books that is currently going around? And it was okay. It's definitely not the most unique concept or plot nor characters. It is absolutely also very tropey, but they are so bingeable and they are so fun to read, and I suppose they work. They are kind of middle ground for me. Then we had Heartstopper Volume 5. I love the Heartstopper series so much. I think it is so beautiful to have this sort of representation in media. I have been dying for it. It should have been everywhere always. It just absolutely warms my heart, both the show and all of the graphic novels. I adore them. I'm kind of sad that the last book is coming out. Is it this year the 6th one is coming out? I don't want it to end ever. Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This I definitely preferred to Ninth House. I'm not gonna lie, after reading Ninth House, I wasn't even gonna consider carrying on with this series, but I'm really happy that I did. Leigh Bardugo and I, we have not had the best streak, but this definitely gave me some faith until she kind of knocked it back down again. You will see soon in another book that I read in 2024. But I just adore the dark academia, occult sort of secret society at Yale setting. I think it works perfectly and I'm excited to carry on with this series. A Novel Love Story by Ashley Poston. I was definitely in the minority with this book in 2024. I actually quite liked it. Did I rate it 5 stars? Yeah, but babe, that was recency bias. It would not be 5 stars now, but I absolutely adore the way that she intertwines magical realism with romance. I think they always just work so perfectly. I definitely did prefer the concept of this more than the execution, but I still had the best time of my life. An author who I always have the best time of my life with is Holly Jackson, especially with the reappearance of Rachel Price. I loved this. I am convinced that Holly Jackson could do no wrong, babe. She could write absolutely anything and I'll be there first in line to read it. I just love them. They are always the best time. Love is at the Museum by Isabel Allende. I'm fairly certain this is on Kindle Unlimited and it is one of her very short stories. I only read it because I've been intrigued to read something from this author for a while. All I remember about this, I'm not gonna lie, is that I was obsessed with the setting. I was absolutely enamored by it, but it was so short that I couldn't really click with any of the characters or the plot, but the setting absolutely carried it. If anyone has any good recommendations from what I can read from her that is an actual novel, please let me know. Change Your Life Essential Poems by Rainer Maria Rilke. Rilke is my favourite poet of all time. I always make sure that I'm reading at least one new collection from him every year. My favourite from him is undoubtedly Letters to a Young Poet. When I say that that book changed my life, I genuinely mean it. Above so many other books I've ever read, this one was such a gorgeous collection with so many different poems from different anthologies from him. If you've never read a Rilke, babe, please make 2025 the year you do. Or if you don't even read poetry, please make him your first poet because you will not regret it. Everything he writes about turns to gold. Woodworm by Leila Martinez is a literary horror with a haunted house that I had the utmost 5-star predictions for, and it unfortunately wasn't, but I still really adored it. I love the setting, I love the atmosphere, I love the haunted house element, of course. I absolutely adored the conversation surrounding generational trauma and family trauma. I think it was done so beautifully and so well. I definitely would like to reread this book. I would recommend it if you're into literary horror. Salt Slow by Julia Armfield. This was her debut and it is also a short story collection. She wrote Our Wives Under the Sea, which is a 5-star god tier book for me. This one was okay. I mean, like most short story collections, there are always going to be stories that you absolutely adore and then ones that you are just going to forget about. Story About Sleep, however, I think about it all of the time. I just love anything Julia Armfield writes and I'm happy that I've now read all of her backlist. When I Arrived at the Castle by Emily Carroll is a gorgeous, tiny little sort of Carmilla retelling graphic novel. The illustrations were utterly gorgeous. I could have rated it 5 stars alone for that, but the plot was fairly non-existent. But it was a very cozy, autumnal, Halloweeny read. The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. Babe, this is what I meant when I said that Leigh Bardugo and I aren't always like this. And this book, we were like this. Did I enjoy the romance in this? Yeah, but everything else I felt was kind of boring, and I definitely found it quite a slog to get through, so I'm intrigued to see what Leigh Bardugo does next. Powerful by Lauren Roberts. I did carry on with this series, and I'm not gonna lie, this book for me, I saw so many people crying over it, and it definitely was quite devastating, but for me it felt quite pointless. Not a lot happened in it. I suppose that's kind of the point. It was also a really short read, but like I said, they're always quick reads, so I can't complain. Then we had my favourite book of 2024, and that was of course It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkin. If you're looking for a post-apocalyptic read that is incredibly eloquent and so lyrical and quite philosophical and existential, this is your read, babe. The best book that I read throughout the entirety of last year. Then I read Funny Story by Emily Henry. Guys, I worship the ground that Emily Henry walks on, but also writes on. This book definitely felt like her most rom-com one. It's probably like my second favourite from her. What I would give to see this book adapted for screen, I have all the hope that all of her adaptations are going to be incredible. Private Rights by Julia Armfield. If you were to ask me, Leah, what was your most anticipated book of 2024? I would have told you Private Rights by Julia Armfield. And then if you would have asked me, Leah, what was your most disappointing read of 2024? I would have told you Private Rights by Julia Armfield. I was so sad that I didn't like this anywhere near as much as I thought I would. We know I love Julia Armfield's writing. I love post-apocalyptic fiction. It has sisters. It also talks about parental loss. Genuinely sounded like it was a book that was kind of written for me and I would have absolutely adored, and it was just okay. I was so sad about it. Slaying the Vampire Conqueror by Carissa Broadbent. I love anything in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. I'm fairly certain that this one is actually a standalone. I genuinely just think that the way Carissa Broadbent writes tension and world building and characters and plot and political intrigue and fantasy, I love it so much. Blue Nights by Joan Didion. This has always kind of been pitched as a sequel to The Year of Magical Thinking, which is my favourite non-fiction book of all time. The way that Joan Didion writes about grief is both so utterly heartbreaking but so real and so raw, and personally for me she really transformed my journey with grieving. I just adore everything that she writes. She's definitely an author who I want to read everything from. The Invention of Morale. I read this because it was pitched for fans of I Have Never Known Men by Jacqueline Hartman, which is obviously one of my favourite books of all time. I'm not gonna lie, I was quite disappointed by this one. I know that I'm probably in the minority with that. I know a lot of people love this book, but it just wasn't for me. I found it a little bit, either I was too dumb or I was too bored. Milkfed by Melissa Broder. This was another one that I was slightly disappointed by, but at this point in time I was also in a massive reading slump. This book alone took me over a month to read. I love Melissa Broder, but the mummy issues in this, just be aware. Recitative by Toni Morrison. She is another author who I love so much, and another one who I want to read everything she ever released. This book is absolutely phenomenal. We are following two young girls. One is white and one is black, but we are never exposed to who is who. It's somewhat a social experiment, and it will absolutely make you question your own morals and your own belief. I think that this is gold. I think that this is art. I think this is a book that everyone should read. The Country Will Bring Us No Peace by Matthew Simard. I would have rated this book 5 stars on the setting alone, but the plot was a little bit missed for me. I love the discussion of humanity in this. This one is another one that feels quite post-apocalyptic and ambiguous and somewhat dystopian, but the ending just fell kind of flat. None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This is probably my favourite Lisa Jewell book that I've read yet. I'm not gonna lie, babe, when I was getting back into reading as a teenager, I had a moment where I solely read adult thrillers, and I read a lot of Lisa Jewell books because I knew that she was one of the most popular authors in that genre, but none of them would land for me. So going into this I was slightly apprehensive, but considering everyone was talking about it and it was so hyped, I actually really enjoyed it. I think like the Riley Saga, if you're looking for a really fun, fast-paced thriller, this is a good one to go for. Briefly A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. This book is the epitome of summer for me. I absolutely adored this. This is the definition of having a character that haunts the narrative. This haunted me. I fear I'm going to think about this for the rest of my life. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I read because I heard that it was like one of the first short stories that was like sci-fi, what was it, like horror? And it's not often that I say this with a book that's literally only about 20 pages. I wasted air. I wasted time of my life, precious time of my life reading this. It was so misogynistic. Definitely interesting, definitely somewhat a product of its time, so there is discussion to be had surrounding it, but I don't want to be part of it. The House Across the Lake by Riley Saga. I was having the time of my life when I was reading the first 50% of this, and then all went downhill. It felt like Riley Saga brainstormed the most outlandish, ludicrous ending to any thriller ever and then plucked it and was like, I just want to test and see what people's reaction is going to be. What? Blue Sisters by Coco Mellows. I feel the way about Coco Mellows the way literary fiction girls feel about Sally Rooney. I will continue to read everything that Coco Mellows writes. This was definitely my preferred one to Cleopatra and Frankenstein. I just loved the discussion surrounding sisterhood and grief. It was utterly heartbreaking but so eloquent and so beautiful, and the way that Coco Mellows just writes humans and raw humans is chef's kiss to me. Frankenstein by Junji Ito. Junji Ito, oddly enough, was quite nostalgic to me. I think because I started reading a lot of his mangas when I was starting my book content, so I love going into his collections. They are always so unique and grotesque and so disturbing, but somewhat sometimes in the best way. This one, as the title suggests, is a Frankenstein retelling. This is probably definitely one of my favourite collections from him. I had a really good time with this one. Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford is another one that I genuinely would have rated 5 stars based on the setting and the atmosphere alone. This one I suppose is a horror, but it's very steeped in nature and folklore, and I love that element in horror so much. Characters in this were so interesting. The plot just unfortunately fell flat for me again, but like I said, the atmosphere would have been 5 stars. I would definitely recommend this one, and the audiobook was great. Then I entered my Abby Jimenez era with Part of Your World, and I absolutely adored it. At the time that I'm filming this, I actually just finished Say You'll Remember Me by Abby Jimenez, which is her book coming out in April. You are going to see all of my thoughts in a vlog soon, so I'm not going to say what I think now. But even though I loved Part of Your World so much, it did piss me off in places. Like, picture this. This is a grown woman. Just because she's wealthy, she doesn't know how to peel a potato. It's giving Kendall Jenner trying to cut a cucumber. The Last House on Needless Street by Katrina Ward. I absolutely love this. This is a psychological thriller slash horror. Ending of this had my jaw on the floor. I swear to God, I had to stare at a blank wall for 2 hours straight. I absolutely adored it. Would highly recommend. Youth Juice by E.K. Safu. I love in literary fiction, or just literary horror in general, discussions surrounding the beauty industry and beauty industry for women specifically. I just love when that is intertwined with horror, and this did it in such a pop culture way that was not cringy at all. It was so fun to read. Would highly recommend. Then we had This Is Where We Talk Things Out. I'm fairly certain that, again, this is on Kindle Unlimited. It's a horror short story. I am going to be cursed by the ending of this book for the rest of my life. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I can vividly picture the ending of this book, and it actually has traumatized me so much that I will have to turn around, put my laptop on, and put like Spirited Away on to fall asleep again. It was terrifying. If you're looking for a good horror short story, this one, it will do it for you. Reckless by Lauren Roberts. Like I said with the other books in this series, they're always so fun and so bingeable to read. Did this one feel like one elongated scene? Yeah. But I also see the ending coming from a mile away, and babe, I haven't even read that many fantasy books and I saw this trope coming. Also, yes. But did I have the time of my life? Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I absolutely ate it up. They are always just so fun. More Days at the Murasaki Bookshop. When I talk about not liking cozy fantasy that much, I also really don't like cozy translated fiction. I absolutely appreciate what they're there for. They are absolutely just reads to feel comforting and cozy, and I love that that exists, but they are definitely not for me. I'm definitely not that type of reader, so I don't think I'm going to pick anything else from this author. Evocation by S.T. Gibson. I worship the ground that S.T. Gibson walks on. I absolutely adore everything that they write. My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I'm so happy that I finally read this, in also the year that it was deemed the #1 best book of the 21st century. Do I agree with that title? I don't think so at all, but I did have a good time with this one. I loved the discussion surrounding girlhood and female friendship. Definitely so real and so raw and so painful. I'm intrigued to carry on with the rest of the series, though I don't really know when I will get to them, but I'm very happy that I finally ticked this one off of my list. Then we have another one of my favourite books of 2024, and that was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mota and Max Gladstone. This is a sci-fi read, and I never read sci-fi, but in the same breath, it's the best love story that I've ever read in my entire life, and simultaneously has some of the best writing that, again, I've ever read in my entire life. Notes on an Execution. I'm not gonna lie, I can't even really remember this, and this was quite sad because it was a book that I was very intrigued by. All I can remember though is that it is, again, one of those reads that discusses the true crime industry superbly, but it wasn't very memorable for me, unfortunately. First Lie Wins by Ashley Elston. Another really fun adult thriller, but I'm not gonna lie, this one was quite predictable. I did genuinely nearly throw my Kindle at the wall when I finished this book because I was like, I've just read 400 pages for what? For that ending, I did not like it, but it was fun. Death at Morning House by Maureen Johnson. Another one of my most disappointing reads of 2024 because Maureen Johnson got me back into reading as a teenager, or the Truly Devious series anyway was one of those series that really got me back into reading, and those are like a god tier series for me. I really want to reread them and see how I feel about them as an adult. So I was expecting great things from another read by Maureen Johnson. I wish I never read it. A Love Song for Ricky Wilde by Tia Williams was one of the best romance books that I read in 2024. Like I've already said with Ashley Poston, Tia Williams again. I mean, this is the only one that I've read from her. I desperately need to read 7 Days in June, but she does magical realism in romance so well. This book was another one that at the end had me sobbing like a bitch, but I loved it so much. I would highly recommend this one. Murder Road by Simone St. James is kind of pitched as both a mystery thriller and a horror. I would say it definitely leans more thriller, I suppose. This again was quite fun and I did binge read them. I feel like I always have similar thoughts with thrillers. They never really last that long in my brain unless the ending is like crazy. I do always fly through them, and this was another instance of that. I'm very intrigued to read more from this author though. I feel like they are somebody who I could really love in this genre. Philosophy of the Home by Emmanuel Coquillard, another one of my favourite books of 2024, and it's non-fiction. I could not believe this. I think about this book all of the time. I actually flick through all of the quotes that I underlined all of the time. This book was absolutely incredible. If you don't read non-fiction, fiction. I would still 100% recommend it. I just absolutely adore anything that discusses homes and the concept of homes and what constitutes to a home, and this was exactly that. The Ministry of Time was one of those books that I feel like when I was reading it, I was quite enjoying it. I didn't really completely agree with all of the hype that it got last year, but now looking back on it, not that memorable. Martyr by Kavir Akbar, however, is definitely one of my favourite books that I read in the year, and also one of my favourite literary fiction books now ever. Following a protagonist who is obsessed with martyrdom until one day he meets this artist who is doing sort of interviews in a museum, and then the entire trajectory of his life just changes. This is another one that the ending, I sobbed. I think about this one all of the time. It's another book that I genuinely hand on heart think that everybody should read. Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonham Young, definitely again one of my favourite romance books that I read in 2024. We need more disability representation in fiction, period, but especially in romance. We need more happy disability representation books, please and thank you. I loved this. The Book of All Loves is, as the title suggests, a book literally just talking about different forms of love. I absolutely adored this for many reasons, but other times I was so incredibly bored. Censored by Junji Ito was definitely my least favourite Junji Ito that I read last year, and probably one of my least favourites from him in general. Just again, wasn't very memorable. One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I went in this expecting to love it, and I had a fun time, but it wasn't really up to the hype that I thought it would be. I loved the magic system. I loved how gothic and atmospheric it was, and I just thought it was quite unique in that magic system, but in terms of the characters, I needed more. I have had people tell me that I'm definitely going to prefer the sequel. I have yet to read it because of that, so hopefully I will. I just love the atmosphere for this. It was like a fun fantasy. It was just okay. Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, definitely my favourite Abby Jimenez. I absolutely adore this. I think about the characters all of the time. This book is just the epitome of an amazing romance book. I am fully convinced that Abby Jimenez can do no wrong. I'm obsessed with everything that she writes. The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This was for a video where I was going to read the entirety of the series. I'm not gonna lie babe, I read The Cruel Prince and then it took me 2 months into The Wicked King to DNF it, so the video has been completely scrapped, but I did read The Cruel Prince. This was fun and it was okay. I definitely wasn't obsessed with it, but it was a book that I was like, okay, if I had read this when I was an actual teenager, I would have eaten it up and it would have become my entire personality, but as an adult now, I just found it okay, and like I said, I DNF'd The Wicked King, so that video got completely scrapped. Odd Spirits by S.T. Gibson, babe. I know I said I worship the ground that S.T. Gibson walks on. I'm gonna say that this is an exception. This was a little novella in the sort of evocation world, and I'm not gonna lie, I would happily read anything from these characters' perspectives, but this and what it was sort of pitched as was slightly different to what I was expecting, so I was slightly disappointed, but like I said, I love these characters, so I would read anything from them. Slewfoot by Brom. This is definitely a perfect occult witchy read to curl up with during the autumn. The illustrations are astonishing. I did at times, I think I was entering another book slump when I was reading this. It was a little bit of a slog to get to sometimes, but I definitely want to reread it because it was so atmospheric. I feel like on a reread it could be a 5-star, and I know I said that the first time, but I'm convinced like this book and just the illustrations alone would be 5 stars. I really quite liked it. Orbital by Samantha Harvey. This obviously won the Booker Prize of 2024, and in my personal opinion, this was the one I was rooting for. I was so happy that it won. This is a tiny novella following a group of people who are orbiting the earth. The way that they talk about the earth, the way that they talk about humanity, and like how borders are just this man-made thing, and in the grand scheme of things it really nothing matters, was utterly astonishing, and paired with the beautiful writing, I really loved this. I would highly recommend. One unfortunately I wouldn't recommend is Graveyard Shift by ML Rio. This was my first ML Rio, and I'm hoping that If We Were Villains is so much better. Literally all I remember about this was that there was a group of people who just looked into a hole where a body should have been and it wasn't, and there were rats and they liked Diet Coke. It unfortunately just missed the mark for me, but I have hope with If We Were Villains. A Swan's Neck on the Butcher's Block by Jenny Fagan, a poetry collection I wish I never read. I'm not gonna lie. Nothing But the Rain is a post-apocalyptic read where it just does not stop raining, and if you get touched by the rain you lose pieces of your memory. The concept, 10 out of 10. I wish I came up with that. I think it's actually beautiful, but the execution was probably only like a 7 out of 10. Really did enjoy this though. It was one I would recommend, especially if you're into post-apocalyptic fiction. We Used to Live Here by Marcus Kluwer, an amazing haunted house book, would highly recommend, so worthy of the hype. The Love of My Afterlife by Kirsty Greenwood. This is The Good Place, the TV show, in a rom-com. So worth it. She's Always Hungry by Eliza Clark, another auto-buy author for me. This was a short story collection that she released in 2024, probably my least favourite work from her. I do often feel like that with short story collections, however, I do feel like sometimes I love them, sometimes I don't, and this one was just middle of the ground for me. Butcher of the Forest by Premi Mohammed. This was a dark fairy tale sort of retelling. I loved this. It was beautiful. My only complaint genuinely is that I wish it was a full novel. I fear this would have become my favourite book of all time if it was a full novel. One I would also recommend if you like that is The Wood at Midwinter by Susanna Clarke. This is a tiny book with beautiful illustrations set in a wood in the winter, obviously. Really beautiful read. I think the way that Susanna Clarke writes is just absolutely astonishing. It was fun. I would recommend it. The Making of June Farrow. I'm not gonna lie, I loved this so much. Adrienne Young is definitely an auto-buy author for me now, and this one floored me. The ending, I could not believe it. Absolutely adored this. Go into this one knowing absolutely nothing. It floored me. Witchcraft, a graphic novel, was a cute graphic novel discussing witchcraft throughout history. I do think it could have been more inclusive. The illustrations were beautiful though. Crimson Moth by Kristen Cicerelli, another romantasy book that I read in 2024 and I loved. So worthy of the hype. This became an utter hyperfixation. I'm not gonna lie. The book Hangover that came after this, God of the Woods by Liz Moore. I know this was so popular in 2024. I really did not like it. I would not recommend it. Uzumaki by Junji Ito. This is labelled as his masterpiece and you know what, I actually do agree, but it was terrifying. I fear I can never look at a snail again. The Women by Kristen Hanna. This was my first ever Kristen Hanna. I'm not a huge historical fiction reader and I feel like I'm definitely in the minority with this book. There were things that I really liked and simultaneously things that I really did not like, so it was very middle of the road for me. I'm intrigued to read more from her. I feel like I would probably prefer The Nightingale, for example. Girl from the Other Side Volume 4 is a gorgeous graphic novel. It is very gothic and whimsical and set in like a dark forest, but I'm not gonna lie, this volume really didn't do it for me. I felt like the first two last volumes that I read were essentially a carbon copy of the same thing. Not really much happened. I don't know if I'm going to carry on with this series. Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. We know Abby Jimenez can do no wrong. Probably not my favourite from her, I'm not going to lie, but I loved it so much. I wish I had saved to read it in summer because I did read it in like December. The Abby Jimenez period is probably my favourite romance author now. Shining by John Foss. I read this because so many people were recommending it as he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2023, I believe. It was okay. It was very stream of consciousness and very surreal, so I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, but it was literally 30 pages, so I am still happy that I read it. You Can Play by Ali Hazelwood. I have nothing to say about this babe. I had the time of my life. Dare I say it, I had the time of my life. I listened to the entirety of this with my best friend whilst we were colouring books, and you know what, it was a canon event and you should have been there. It was hilarious. One Perfect Couple by Ruth Ware. I hadn't read a Ruth Ware for a really long time and this one was fun. It was kind of giving Love Island but a thriller and it was really interesting. It's definitely a good fun thriller. Apologies if the camera angle has changed slightly. My camera battery died, but we are here with the last 10, I believe, books that I read of 2024. Next is Monstrilio by Gerardo Simona Cordova. This was my first ever book club pick and I love literary horror so much. This was so beautiful. The whole concept and the whole metaphor of grief was absolutely astounding. If you like literary horror, I highly recommend this one. Intermezzo by Sally Rooney is undoubtedly Sally Rooney at her best. This is my favourite Sally Rooney that I've ever read. Again, the discussions surrounding grief and family dynamics were just absolutely astounding. I think Sally Rooney at her best just writes characters that are so real and so raw, that are always so painful to read from because they are so human but so astounding nonetheless. This is definitely my favourite Sally Rooney. Yeah, I would highly recommend. Set the Record Straight by Hannah Bonham Young was the first festive novella that I read in December. Like I've already said, I adore Hannah Bonham Young so much. This is a really sweet sapphic Christmas novella. I would definitely recommend it for the festive period. Another book I think I would recommend for the festive period is My December Darling by Lauren Asher. This is still the only Lauren Asher book I've ever read. I don't know if I will read more. Are they good? Definitely feel free to give me some other recommendations from her if her other romances are worth the read. The Mistletoe Mystery by Nita Prose, as I've already touched upon, I'm never going to read anything from this author again. Her mysteries just aren't for me, but this was a festive novella in that series. Of Dogs and Walls by Yuko Tsushima is a short story collection. Again, I've never read anything from this author before. I'd actually never heard about them prior. This short story collection actually floored me. I loved it so much. I desperately want to read something else from them now, especially a full-on novel. Writing style was absolutely astonishing. The atmospheres, just the way they painted a setting was so perfect, and paired with the lyrical writing, I was completely obsessed with it. Death in Her Hands by Atessa Moshfegh. This book is messy. If you love unreliable protagonists, bonus points, it's an elderly woman and it's utterly unhinged. I would recommend it. I actually think it's probably up there as one of my favourite Atessa Moshfeghs. The ending did let me down slightly, but I really like this. I love Atessa Moshfegh's narratives. I then read Holiday Romance by Catherine Walsh. I actually think that this is probably my favourite festive book that I've ever read. Definitely up there with Love Like Farms. Anyway, this was so fun. The tension and the chemistry between these characters, it really felt like a classic Christmas rom-com. I would do Unspeakable Things to see this as an adaptation. I really enjoyed it. Definitely add it to your TBRs for the next festive period. Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh was my December book club pick and I really adored this. For all of my book club picks up on my Patreon, I do like spoiler-filled reading vlogs, so if you ever want to see any of them, they're always up there. This was astounding. It is a fever dream narrative, incredibly ambiguous. You will have more questions at the end than you did the beginning, but the writing, I loved it. And then it feels right to say that I ended the year with Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is one of my favourite books of all time. This again was my Patreon Classics book club pick for December. If you were to ever cut me open, I would bleed the Brontes. I would bleed all of their works, every single word they've ever written in their entire life. I am obsessed with them. I will say Jane Eyre is my most reread book in my entire life. I think this was my 7th reread and I probably liked it least now than I have done before, but it still stands as one of my favourites. I just love this book so much. But yeah guys, those were the 119 books that I read in 2024. Please let me know if you have read any of them, whether you like them or you dislike them, if you agree with my opinions or not. I would love to have a discussion about any of these in the comments. Or if you watch until the very end of the video and you don't know what to comment but you want to show you stayed until the end, comment any book emoji. As always, if you did enjoy this video and you are not yet subscribed, it would mean the absolute world to have you here. We have some fun videos coming in the next couple of weeks. I am so excited and I would love for you to be here for them. All of my socials are linked down in the description box below. But yeah guys, thank you so much for being here and for spending some time with me. I really hope you enjoyed, and I will see you again very soon with another video.